Hi, everyone. Welcome to MIT Press Live. I'm Hannah Nyren, Digital Marketing Manager at the MIT Press, and I will be hosting today's talk. I'm really excited to present today's special guest, Howard Gardner, author of A Synthesizing Mind, and much more than that. Howard, great to have you here today.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So to start off, for those who might not know you or your work, could you introduce yourself in a couple sentences?
Sure. Until a few days ago, I shared with Joe Biden both the birthplace, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and an age, but he's older than I am, so he turned 78. We both left Scranton when we were young, and I went off to Harvard, and for better or for worse, never left. I was an undergraduate and graduate there, and eventually became a psychologist with particular interest in the mind and in education. Unlike most research psychologists, I'm a book writer more than an article writer. I've studied other people's minds for decades, but I decided in this book to focus on my own mind, which it turns out, according to me, is a synthesizing mind.
That's awesome. So I guess to start, let's talk about the book. The book is called A Synthesizing Mind. And as you said, you've written a number of books, but what's different about this one?
Well, I've written lots of books, but in most other cases, I study something else and put it together in a way that makes sense to me. And I've written about intelligence, creativity, leadership, curriculum, and so on. But even if you've written a lot of books, when you hold a mirror to yourself, it's a very different kind of enterprise. First of all, in one sense, you're the expert, but in another sense, what other people say and think about you is not something that's within your knowledge span, but also the rhythm and the lilt and the feel of a memoir is very, very different. I mean, if I'm writing about, let's say, creativity, I give a definition, I describe some creative people, some people are not so creative, and then talk about what it's like to become creative. But what about, how do you write about yourself when you were 10 years old, your parents, what they gave you, what you felt worked well in education? And then if you're like me and you've worked in many different areas, what caused you to drop one thing and go to another and then come back to it again? What worked well? What was a screw up? What would you wish you still could do if you had more time? What are you very happy that you don't have to do anymore? So it's a very different kind of feel. And in fact, there's a good book on different kinds of literary genre. And I didn't have to read about how to do theater or how to write biographies of other people, but I read carefully about memoirs because it's a very special kind of genre and it's very easy to screw up.
That's true. Memoirs can be a very difficult medium. So, again, you talk about your own mind in this book and you talk about synthesizing mind. So for those who don't know, what is the most basic definition of a synthesizing mind?
Well, I'm the right person to ask because I coined the phrase, right? So at least for now, I get to define it. The synthesizing mind is a mind that becomes interested in questions, issues, problems, looks as widely and as carefully and as diligently as possible as all the possible source of information on that particular question or problem. In my case, it would be a research issue, but it could be a business problem, it could be a political problem. And then, and here's where the art of synthesizing comes in, how do you organize it? Do you make tables? Do you make charts? Do you write equations? Do you make mind maps? Do you do mind modeling? How do you get feedback from other people about whether the synthesis makes sense to them? Does it make sense to you? And then you put it out there, and sometimes people say, I already knew that. Sometimes they say, you got it all wrong. Sometimes they say, well, this is good, it's a good text. But occasionally say, nobody's ever thought about this before in this way. And then that becomes a creative synthesis. A good example, which many people will know about, is economics textbooks used to be a certain way. And then about 50, 60 years ago, an economist named Paul Samuelson wrote a different kind of textbook. And actually, everybody said, this is a great textbook. And for the next 20 or 30 years, people wrote textbooks like Paul Samuelson. His synthesis became the new state of the art in that particular genre. One other thing, Hannah, I describe the kind of synthesizing I do as partway between journalism on the one hand and experimental science on the other. Journalists synthesize, but they have a deadline, and when they finish something, got to move on to something else. And of course, they don't have a lot of time, and they may not have enough technical information to really do what we call long form journalism, where you get money from a publisher or a foundation, and you can become more of a synthesizer the way I am. Experimental scientists have a hypothesis, they test it out, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, maybe it works partially, and then they write an article, and then they go on and do the next experiment. Now, full stop. There's some journalists who really want to synthesize more broadly, but as I say, they have to be given a lot of time. They have to be given what's called long form journalism, the kind of 50,000 word articles that used to appear in the New Yorker, like when John Hersey wrote about Hiroshima. And there's some scientists and scholars who like to synthesize the way I do. People would know Jill Lepore, the historian, Mary Beard, the classicist, Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, and they continue doing work in their own fields, but they write these large, Steve Pinker is another example, they write these large synoptic or synthetic works, and sometimes, like me, that's what they really like to do.
Yeah, that's right. And those are some great examples that you listed. But what about people who don't have synthesizing minds? What's the alternative? What are the other types of mindsets?
I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to pre-pose another question.
Okay.
Another answer, maybe I should say. Yeah, I'm trying to get the world to focus on what a synthesizing mind is, because I think that's the most important mind for our time. And we can talk later about why I think that. But what I believe is that we have not done a careful study of what it is to be a good synthesizer. And indeed, psychology, my field, has dropped the ball, and I know exactly why. It's because you can't study synthesizing in a lab experiment. It takes lots of periods of time, and you'll never get tenure if you study Charles Darwin, who took 30 years to create the origin of the species. So a large part of the last part of the book is my own suggestions about how to make synthesis more of a, more on the radar screen of educators and of parents and of people themselves, so that in a sense I can give them scaffolding so they can become better synthesizers. I mean, I'll use a funny analogy just occurred to me. Most of us are not poets, and if most of us tried to write poetry, we wouldn't be very good. But if poetry was an important part of the curriculum in Hungary, for example, and I didn't pick that out completely randomly, or Yugoslavia, we'd all be much better poets. And so putting synthesizing on the radar screen, especially for educators, or if people want to educate themselves, is my move to help people be better prepared for this century. Now, your question was, what are the other kinds of minds? And I've actually looked at earlier work at 5 kinds of minds. 3 of them are what I call cognitive, and that's sort of what I'm an expert in. And that is the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, and the creating mind. And that's a continuum. Discipline is what you do in high school and college. You study history, you study literature, you study physics, etc. Synthesizing is what we've been talking about. You take lots of stuff and put it together. Creating is reaching for a brass ring that's very far away. You may fail. I failed most of the time. But if you succeed, it changes the conversation radically. That's probably what happened with my work on intelligence. Now, there are 2 other kinds of minds which are less cognitive and more having to do with human relations. And that's actually what I've been studying for the last 20 or 30 years, but it's not particularly a topic for today. What I call the respectful mind and the ethical mind. And that has to do with how we deal with other people. Respectful is how do you deal with friends, neighbors, people who are in the world or maybe on the screen with you. But ethics is how we operate as professionals or citizens, even with vis-a-vis people whom we don't know. And I happen to think that's very important, but that's not cognitive. That's not sort of how the brain works as a computing device. It's more how do we relate to one another. I mean, Heather is on the screen. I don't know if people can see her or not, but we're having a moral or respectful conversation. But if we encounter each other in our roles as accountants or lawyers or pediatricians, that's more of a professional role. So those are the 5 minds. But while I thought about synthesizing to some extent for years, this is the book where I've really focused on it.
That's amazing. So tell me more about your childhood and what led you to become so interested in, developmental psychology, cognitive science, all these things that you've been studying for many decades.
Okay, and of course that's a large part of the 200-page book, which we're hawking today. Let me answer that in 2 parts. I have an interesting personal history, but nobody will know, including me, how much of that personal history was important to having the kind of mind I developed. So my parents were German Jews, quite comfortable. They arrived in America on Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when hundreds of Jews were killed, synagogues were destroyed, and so on. They had $5 in their pocket. They moved to Scranton, a place they'd never heard of, and where, frankly, none of us particularly wanted to live, but there was a job during the war. So, and when my mother was pregnant with me, my brother was killed in a freak accident. And this was tremendously traumatic to my parents because they'd lost everything. And later, fortunately, when I was essentially grown up, my parents said, if we hadn't been expecting you, we would have killed ourselves, because they had lost everything.
Wow.
Family, money, their homeland, and their child. So even though I don't think I was hyper conscious of it, there was a lot weighing on me, on my shoulders when I was young. But probably more relevant to synthesizing mind, like a number of people whom I know, and maybe people who are watching this Zoom cast, I love to read, and I read completely undisciplined. I read whatever was available. I used to read encyclopedias. I read 2 encyclopedias, and I love to talk about it, even if people didn't want to hear about it. Probably something that was somewhat unusual is when I was 7, I began to produce a newspaper, and newspapers are nothing like today. You had to put little pieces of type in what was called a platen and turn it around in a mimeograph machine. And I'm sure nobody read the newspaper, but not too many 7-year-olds. So I both read a lot and wanted to write a lot. And probably people who were much more insightful for me probably thought, well, he's going to be some kind of a thinker or writer. But I was also very much involved with music, was a serious pianist as a young child, and music is incredibly important to me. My first research was on the arts. I play the piano every day, not very well, but it's very important to me. And one of the insights I had about myself is that when I write, I'm obviously using linguistic and I hope logical intelligence, but I'm also writing using musical and naturalist intelligence. Now, what does that mean? Naturalist is I'm constantly classifying and trying to figure out the right categories of things, just as a naturalist figures out plants, animals, rocks, clouds, and so on. And music, I'm more classical music than I am other genre, but a classical symphony or concerto has a definite structure. Themes are introduced, they're recapitulated, they're intertwined, they're in different keys. And that's how I write a book. And someone said to me the other day, I'm reading your book, you're a good storyteller. And I said, yeah, there are a lot of little stories, but there's also a bigger story. And I think that's, you might say, that's the theme of the symphony, so to speak. The synthesizing symphony. I don't think anybody's ever said that before, but we could say that's what I'm up to.
I love that metaphor. It's like you wrote a symphony. That's great. So, your childhood is a large part of the book, but what about your life as a student? How did your experiences as a student reflect the way that you approach not only your thoughts about how students' brains work, but your writings relevant to education?
Okay, again, lots in the book about that. I was a good student. In Scranton, Pennsylvania, I was a star student. My parents didn't know what to do with me. So this is a funny part of the book. When I was 13, they took me to Hoboken, New Jersey, to the Stevens Institute of Technology to have me tested. And for a full week, I had to take every battery of tests. It cost hundreds of dollars, which now would be like thousands of dollars. This is the 1950s. And at the end, the psychologist called us in and said, well, Mrs. Gardner Howard's a talented kid. He can probably do anything, but he's especially gifted at clerical work. And I kind of groaned to myself, why did we schlep to Hoboken and spend a week to tell I could be a clerk, something I had no interest in doing. My parents were told I should go to Phillips Academy, which is a very good secondary school, Phillips Andover. But I didn't want to leave home, so we compromised on a decent but not particularly illustrious secondary school named Wyoming Seminary. But then I went to college, and I really felt at home and could be free for the first time at Harvard College. This is in the early 60s. It wasn't that hard to get into. It wasn't that expensive, but I was surrounded by people who loved the mind, the life of the mind. And last Saturday, believe it or not, I spent a Zoom call with 13 of my friends from college. We're still friends together, and it was like picking things up where we were left it off in 1965 when we graduated. But I was like a kid at the candy store in college. I loved taking different courses. I loved meeting with professors who were interested in meeting with me and were helpful to me. And I studied a very broad interdisciplinary field, which had a ridiculous name, social relations, but it was basically psychology, sociology, and anthropology. And at the time, I didn't know which of these fields I would go into, but I was interested, so to speak, in the social sciences. Then I had a number of life-changing experiences, which I talk about in the book. And I eventually decided to go into developmental psychology because I was very influenced by Piaget, who was the dominant developmental psychologist of history, and my own then teacher, Jerome Bruner, who was also a distinguished developmental psychology. But I hated graduate school because whereas in a sense, the world was free to me as an undergraduate, I could do what I wanted and people just said, go for it. As a graduate student, they would try to socialize me to be a certain kind of professional, in this case, an experimental child psychologist. And even though I learned how to do it, and I think it's a great thing to do, it wasn't where I was at. And the faculty knew that wasn't where I was at. And one of my professors, I will not name him because they were all men at the time, wanted to kick me out of graduate school. And so I had an existential moment. I can see it to this day. I sat down in my home. I was then married and about to have a first child. And I wrote all the reasons why I should stay in graduate school and all the reasons that I quit. I was this close to quitting because I just didn't like it. And I would have gone to law school, which is what people do when they don't know what to do, even today. But then I had an aha moment. And I said, Howard, my job is not to please the professors, nor is it to do what my fellow classmates are doing and what they expect me to do, but to think about what I want to do and to make sure I don't get kicked out, but to basically pick up the degree and the accoutrements I need so I can then spend the rest of my life doing what I want to do. This didn't mean exactly what I want to do. Nobody gets to do that, though I probably came closer than most people. But the idea was sometimes if you go in the military, you have to do what the military wants, but that doesn't mean you have to become like the sergeant whom you can't stand.
That's quite an entertaining story.
And do you remember my episode with Stanley Milgram, the outstanding social psychologist?
Mm-hmm.
In my first year, I had to take a social psychology course because there was no developmental psychology track. Stanley Milgram was probably the most eminent social psychologist of the last century. You will all know him because he did the obedience to authority studies, where people were made to administer shocks to another subject in a psychological experiment, and the subjects began to scream, stop this, you're hurting me. And unknown to the experimental subject who was being studied, they weren't really being killed or hurt. They were just screaming. And what Milgram showed was that most of us are much more like Hitler's supporters or Hitler's willing executioners. We're willing to shock much more. So Stanley Milgram was very brilliant, and I was a student. And at a certain point, I challenged him. And I'm very straightforward. I'm sure I didn't say you're stupid or anything like that, but I said, what about this and what about that? He then attacked me mercilessly for, it seemed like 10 hours, it was probably 10 minutes. That's not so interesting. What was interesting is no other student, nor the other faculty member named Tom Pettigrew came to my defense. And here I am beginning graduate school. I'm like the first year of medical school, the first year of law school. You've all seen those movies. And I'm saying, what the F is going on here? And afterwards, Tom Pettigrew came up to me and said, I'm sorry about how Professor Milgram treated me. I said, well, thank you. But I was shocked that nobody came to my defense. And this was one of a number of learning experiences in the book where in the end, you have to defend yourself and you have to decide what you want to do, whether it's to stay in graduate school or whether to confront somebody. And even though I'm pretty much for law abiding and pretty conformist, I don't allow other people to dictate things. And that's not a major theme of the book, but it is somewhere where I think I'm different from a lot of my peers.
Yeah, I do think that was an interesting part of the book where you stood out. But I did find some of the earlier stories, at least, I found them relatively relatable because I also was a student who would try to correct the teacher and get in trouble. And I was constantly getting into those sorts of situations when I was a kid. But what I found really interesting is, and relatable, was that you also had a learning disability or a visual disability. I had an auditory disability and always struggled with that, but it was interesting hearing about how, even though you were an excellent student, you still had a couple of struggles with different things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, speaking frankly, Hannah, my visual problems, which are severe, did not interfere with my learning, but
Okay.
they had very interesting impact on my life. I have no depth perception. I'm colorblind, and I'm prosopagnosic. Prosopagnosia means I can't recognize people by their faces. This was not particularly a problem in school because even if you're prosopagnosic, you only run into 20 people every day and you can figure out who they are probably from their odor. My daughter had prosopagnosia, and we only discover this when you're in your 20s. And you begin to go to meetings and you meet somebody at dinner, and the next morning their hair is different or the dress is different, you're clueless about who they are. But the interesting thing, Hannah, is that I became very interested in the visual arts. And I wrote my thesis about detecting style in painting. My early work was about the arts. And in fact, for many years, I was on the board of the Museum of Modern Art. So I, in a sense, decided to focus on my handicap, which is visual, and to see what I could learn by actually doing research on that. And I got interested. And of course, you get better at everything. I mean, with your central auditory processing deficit, you could not have been interviewing somebody remotely when you were a kid, but you learn to compensate. Still, the most common question I'm asked about multiple intelligences is, should we focus on strengths or weaknesses? And my quick answer is focus on your areas of strength, because then you can help people with that area and they can help you with areas where you're not very good. Nonetheless, if you're obstinate like me and you want to study painting, go ahead and you'll get better, but you won't be as good as somebody who's got a very good eye and can see colors and is not prosopagnosic and so on. So there's some lessons in the book, but I don't think the book is preachy. It's more, hey, this happened to me. Do you find it interesting?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good positive note to end the main part of our talk on and to open up for the audience Q&A. So we have some directions for the audience. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A. We will answer as many questions as we can today. So we will end at 1:30, but we have a good amount of time for Q&A.
And I try to be relatively quick. So if I go on, say enough hours, so we can have more questions, okay?
Good, that would be super helpful. While we're waiting for people to ask their questions, I have a couple more questions for you. One of them is, what kind of person would be interested in your book? What's your pitch to the audience? Why should they read it?
Well, I think there are three different kinds of people. One is people who actually know me and love me or hate me. And there's some, and I've had wonderful feedback from friends and family. Number two, people are interested in multiple intelligences because I not only talk about how I came up with that idea and the synthesizing that I did. But I also talk about how I think about that 40 years later, and that's new. The MI stuff itself is old. You don't need to read the book to find out about the theory, but if you want to know how the progenitor thinks about it decades later. But then the third reason is if you're convinced that knowing what synthesizing is, and particularly one of the things I talk about, the difference between human synthesizing and computer or artificial intelligence synthesizing, and why it's so important, and what you might be able to do to be better, either doing it yourself or teaching others. It's kind of it's a soft touch guide to how to become a better synthesizer. And if you're interested in all three, it'd be a great Christmas present for all of your friends.
Yeah, it'll definitely be a Christmas present for someone in my family. So we have a couple of questions now. They're all suddenly popping in. Jessica Mink asks, how do people with synthesizing minds deal with each other? Great question.
It is a good question. I think it's easier to deal with other synthesizers because you're curious. You like to have access to different kinds of information. You're always restructuring, reconfiguring stuff that's in your mind. And I would imagine that most of my friends have a synthesizing gene, so to speak. It's more difficult if somebody is the opposite, which is an analyzing kind of mind, which likes to go deeper and deeper in just a few things, wants to make sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and feels a bit nervous and uncomfortable when they have to expand and pay attention to other kinds of things. This doesn't mean that if you're a good synthesizer that you can't be a good analyst. Many people are good at both. And it doesn't mean that if you're a very good analyst, you can't become a good synthesizer. But it's funny, of my college friends who participated in this call, there's a mathematician, there's a doctor, a quite famous doctor, there's a movie maker, everybody else is a lawyer. And lawyers, I think, are people who, they have to always be putting stuff together and then move on to the next case. And one of the persons is also a lawyer and a journalist.
I think lawyers also need to have a bank of information in their minds to connect the dots at a moment's notice.
Right, but if you're a lawyer, you're well aware that nowadays so much of the analysis is going to be done by artificial intelligence. And it's the final pitch that you make when you're writing a brief or speaking to the jury, the stuff that those of us who know about law only watching television say, that's where your genius has to come in.
That's true. It is a lot of paperwork too. All right, so we have a couple more questions. And by a couple, I mean a lot. How can one grow one's ability to synthesize?
Well, I think that if you are a teacher or a parent, you want to start young with your child and not only expose them to lots of different things, whether it's books, movies, games, and so on, but talk about it and talk about how these things are connected. How are they not connected? So make that part of the conversation. If it's you yourself, I think the best way to do it is to take an assignment that either you've already been given by your work or by your curiosity, or an assignment that you'd like to do. I mean, for example, I wanted to learn more recently about the 18th century Enlightenment and in which ways it was helpful to us today, in which way it was not. So first, you end up looking for books on the topic, and you read a few, and you talk to people who know something about it, say, what should I read? And then you say, well, what's the puzzle? What is it that I don't know about, but would like to know about, which helps me with my understanding about the Enlightenment's relationship today? And then, this is what I write in the book, how do you keep tab of things? I tend to type stuff out and write about it, but then I create graphs and taxonomies and maps and metaphors and images, which help me organize and put the stuff together. But then I try it out on other people. I have not only colleagues, but I have a small working group at Harvard, and we try everything out on one another. And the good thing is that they've learned to be much more critical of me, and that's good because the big danger when you get to be owned and well known and nobody wants to confront you with what you say doesn't hold any water. And then ultimately, you put it out there. Something which I hadn't heard of 5 years ago, I've become an inveterate blogger. I would estimate I have 300 to 500 blogs that I've done in the last 5 years. And in the Synthesizing Mind, there are 150 blogs just about multiple intelligences. And I blog for myself, but I'm very happy when somebody else comments and teaches me something. And these blogs are kind of mini syntheses about what I'm thinking about. I mean, I'll just give one example. I read a very interesting biography of the young John F. Kennedy. Now, there are many, many books about John Kennedy. So you might say, why read a new one? But this is a great book. But it got me to think about how John Kennedy was really unusual for a president or a politician, because when he was young, he hung around with those kinds of people because his father was a very powerful ambassador. So he could think about Winston Churchill as somebody who could he aspire to. This is not something that Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or Harry Truman, because they never knew any presidents when they were young. And so this was taking something that I was interested in anyway. How big are your circles of responsibility, we call it. And when you're young, what kind of access do you have to these people? So wandered a bit. Next question.
It's interesting that you didn't list off Bush Jr. because he definitely was around some presidents when he was young.
Right, and that was probably an advantage and a disadvantage.
Yeah, a lot of competition there.
His brother too, yeah.
All right, so we have another question. Please suggest 2 of your books that would be eye-openers to an enthusiastic novice teacher.
A novice teacher.
I thought that was a little bit of an oxymoron too. Maybe they're just being humble.
Well, I'm going to mention 3 books. If you're teaching with young kids, The Unschooled Mind, which is about all the stuff we know when we're 5 years old, some of which is very valuable and some of which just gets in the way. The Disciplined Mind, which has been the book in which I talk most seriously about how to use multiple intelligence to learn history, to learn the arts, to learn science. And then a book which I think is arguably my most original and important book, but not one that got the attention that I wish it had, a book called Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed. Came out in 2011, based on lectures I'd given at the Museum of Modern Art in 2008. But I think I foresaw a lot of the problems with truth and truthiness. In fact, the subtitle is Educating for the Virtues in the Era of Twitter and Truthiness. And in 2008, people did not realize the kind of screwed up political and moral terrain that we're dealing with now. But I saw it there, and I had a lot to say about what it means to organize an education around Virum, Bonum, and Pulchrum. That was the motto of Wyoming Seminary: truth, beauty, and goodness. And that's what I think an education is about. But that book is less useful for people who are teaching young kids than it is for people who are teaching high school and college. So maybe more than you wanted to know, but at least this was an authority in my readings and writings.
Well, you are the expert on your writing. So this is a funny question because I don't know if it actually is a thing, but I'm curious as to whether or not it is. How is left-handedness or mixed-handedness related to the synthesizing mind? So how is being left-handed or ambidextrous related?
That's a great question. I have no idea what the answer is, but it's a great question because I was actually born left-handed. And my parents, as I said, were German. And when you had a child who was left and picked up a pencil in the left hand, you just put it in the right hand. I know it looks opposite on the screen, but believe me, this is my right hand. I didn't discover that I was born a lefty until I went to Boy Scout camp and I picked up a gun and the counselor said, "You're a lefty." And I went home and my mother knew something about children. She said, "Yes, you were born lefty, we made you right." And I turned out my grandfather was righty. I've got a son and a granddaughter who are left-handed. So my family is very strong lefty. But in the olden days, and even today in certain demographies, left-handed is considered to be a bad thing. So people are made into right-handers. And I don't think I was a terribly strong left-hander. The only thing that I would say is that left-handers have to adjust more, and sometimes they get to see the world in a somewhat different way. Interestingly, though, we don't know what to make out of this. Out of the last 5 or 6 presidents, I think they were all left-handed. Gerald Ford was left-handed, Obama was left-handed, Clinton was left-handed, I think Bush was left-handed. So maybe you could become a president if you can't become a synthesizer. Trump doesn't write, but he's right-handed. He signs with his right hand. So the answer is, we don't know, but certainly in many areas like art, architecture, left-handers are overrepresented, and it's easy to understand why that's the case.
Could you ever teach yourself to just fully be left-handed again? Have you done that?
No, and fortunately, even though, again, this looks like my left hand, it's my right hand. I've got some arthritic problems. It's still functioning okay. But you know, we're also lucky living in the 21st century, because there are all sorts of things which we would have been completely unable to do a century ago. But now that there's all kinds of technologies that can serve to help us out. But no, I hope I don't have to ever use one hand alone for more than a short period of time.
That's interesting. Okay, so here's another question. Could you talk through a daily practice that would help to cultivate and develop the synthesizing mind? Which is that would be really nice if there was one. How does this? Okay, there's another part to that question. So I guess first questions is, could you talk through a daily practice that would help to cultivate and develop the synthesizing mind?
Well, I'm going to speak completely autobiographically. Every day I read the New York Times. It's a broad publication, but it has a political leaning. Every day my wife watches CNN, and I will not watch CNN with her unless she also puts on Fox News, which she hates. But every day I look through the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, because I want to see a spectrum of views. And so, you know, if you ask me, well, what about this woman who, wouldn't sign the transition papers, or, does Trump have a leg to stand on when he goes to court? I don't have to just give the received wisdom that the New York Times does. I can talk about what the Financial Times says or the Wall Street Journal, which are very different kinds of publications. Also, I read The Economist every week, and again, that's not American, that's from England. And I'm doing a project in Singapore, and I was on at 8 a.m. this morning with my Singapore colleagues, 9 p.m. Singapore time, and asked them for some magazines to read from Singapore. So if you are a reader, the thing to do is to read lots of different things, because that has to expand your mind. Now, if you're not a reader, the worst thing about 2020 is people go to the Facebook site and the feed, and they just look at what their friends are looking at. That's disastrous if you want to have a synthesizing mind. But if you expose yourself to what other people say, what other people write, what other people pay attention to, talk radio. If you listen to NPR, you should listen to talk radio just to see what the other half of the country is listening to. So,
I've done it a lot.
If you live in Cambridge, it's not fun, but you expand your horizon. But then, of course, you have to make use of it. I make use of it by writing and blogging, but I also make use of it in conversation. I like to talk to people about stuff that I don't know about and learn from them. And my kids tell me, what's to watch on television, what movies to go to, what music to listen to, and so on. So yeah, broaden your canvas, and then force yourself or push yourself to make use of what you have. Every day I walk for an hour around Cambridge at 6 a.m. in the morning. There's nobody there. I wear a mask, but it's probably not necessary. But I'm trying to put stuff together, and often I'll stop and write myself a message because I'm afraid I'll forget it. And it's my own little synthesis for the day. Maybe I should have a column, the synthesis for the day.
That would be great, actually. I think a lot of people here would read that probably. So the next part of that question is, how does the synthesizing mind grow or erode in the age of technology, social media, and the internet?
Well, I think I gave partially the answer when I said you need to make sure that you expose yourself in language and in pictorial things to a range of different experiences. Don't get stuck in a rut. And that's harder as you get older. It's much easier to stay in the same rut, and you have to fight against it. I fight against it mostly by working with much younger people, because they have, and with my own family, my wife and I are both teaching our grandchildren during the pandemic, and it's very helpful for us because we're learning too. So I think that's one important thing to do. The other thing is to give yourself a problem or issue to kind of be on your radar screen for a while. And if you get stuck in a rut, do something. Namely, call up somebody who knows about it, or look at an entirely different source of information, or force yourself to write about it. Like, I know nothing about religion. I've just written a long essay about religion, and I've sent it to a dozen people. And of course, some of them don't answer, and some of them say that's great, or some of them say it's crap. But of course, you learn from the ones who say this makes sense, this doesn't, and so on. So it's like a muscle. I have never thought of the analogy. Synthesizing is a muscle, and if you don't exercise the muscle, it's going to dissipate. But if you exercise it, it's going to get stronger, but particularly if you get good feedback. But don't delude yourself into thinking that you know whether you're doing a good job, because you might completely miss the boat. As far as the AI angle is concerned, this is kind of my own thing. I think a lot of stuff which until 2010, human beings did routinely, whether we were doctors or lawyers or clerks or worked in factories or even, did art, is going to be done as well or better by AI, other kinds of powerful computational devices. And so it's very bad to train to do something which in 5 years is going to become anachronistic. So I think one has to say, what are the abilities and what are the capacities that are least like to be able to be done by some kind of a computational device? Often it's called soft skills. I don't particularly like that phrase, but it is more fun to talk to another human being than to talk to Siri or Alexa, or whatever their names are. And by the same token, and this is a strong argument in the book, the kind of work that I do, these kind of big syntheses, are the last things that AI programs will be able to do. I make the joke that if somebody fed all my books into a program, that program could spew a book that would sound very much like what I write, but it wouldn't be a book about a new topic. It'd be a book about the topics I've already written about. But if I got interested in something that I haven't been interested in before, that machine could never do it. It's just like the machine can't recognize faces from a category which it hasn't seen millions of faces for. So I guess the takeaway is outsmart the machines by cultivating soft skills and capacities which are the least likely to be substitutable for by robots or by AI programs.
Right, and you're not the first person I've heard who hates the term soft skills, but we don't really have a great substitute for it, but they're very crucial skills.
Well, I don't mind calling them human skills, but human skills involve thinking well and analyzing well and synthesizing well. But one of the reasons why people, especially in business, are attracted to multiple intelligence is because if you don't understand people well and how to interact with them, and you don't understand yourself well, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and even writing a memoir doesn't demonstrate conclusively that you know yourself, then you're not going to be very good at the workplace. My sister read the memoir, and she said, "Howard, you're not a replacement child. Mom was pregnant with you already." I said, "Well, she was pregnant with me already, but you can't tell me I didn't feel like I was a replacement child." And that's kind of, those are the personal intelligences at work.
It's a good anecdote for that. So from T. Parker, during your formative years, during elementary and secondary school, how did you relate to your peers and they with you? And what did you learn from them that later influenced you in your later years?
That's a great question. It's not one that I write about, but I've thought a lot about my childhood. I think like many people I know, I'm probably basically introverted. Um, but I always had a few close male friends, and we were peers, in every sense of the word. I still remember their names, one Jewish, one Catholic, one Protestant. It was very cosmopolitan. Um, but it was only when I went to secondary school, which was a little bit more expansive, that I became more social and learned more how to interact with people, including those of the other sex. Got interested in girls, women, whatever you want to say. And I don't think that I have a special gift for friendship, but I'm lucky to have always had friends, including these friends that I mentioned, the 13 of us, 14 altogether, who got together 6 months ago and got together now. And I do think that being a connector is helpful. My mother was an incredible connector. That's, I don't know, it's a Stanley Milgram word, but it's a word for somebody who doesn't just connect ideas, that would be synthesizing, but connect people. So if you write to me about something, if I don't know anything about it, I will almost always say, well, here's 2 or 3 people who you could get in contact with, and here's a couple of things to look at. And of course, I'm always annoyed, though I try to hide it, when someone says, tell me about multiple intelligences, when you could live for the next 1,000 years and you wouldn't run out of all the stuff that's already available on the web. So but I think I've been lucky, learned a lot from friends. I've had good friendships. I remember those that didn't work out, and that's a source of sadness. And I know that one of the recommendations of positive psychology is that you should thank people and write apologies and that sort of stuff. And I guess I believe what my close friends believe. You should go over 50%, but you don't have to go 99%. Life is a two-way streak. I'm sure that every advice to the lovelorn columnist says something similar to that. So you can go to 16, maybe 70%. I don't know whether that's the questioner had in mind, but those are some thoughts.
Great. So here's another question. Do you think our schools have done enough to cultivate synthesizing minds?
I don't think people have had the category, but of course, people who help students write reports or carry out experiments, they can either nudge them to being narrow and analytic, or they can broaden them to make connections and so on. So I think it has a lot to do with the teachers, and it has a lot to do with the philosophy of the school. I tell about this anecdote. When I was a college freshman, I thought I was a pretty good student, but Stan Katz, who was teaching my freshman seminar, and who still is a close friend, he's 85 years old, we were in touch last week, wrote on my paper, "Howard, isn't this a first draft?" And that was like stabbing me, because he was saying I wasn't stretching enough. And so I think it's an interactive kind of thing. That is, what kind of school you are, what kind of habits you get from parents and friends, but which way teachers push you. And if schools and teachers value synthesizing, then you'll be much better at it. What I hate about contemporary American education is that already at the secondary school level, they're saying, we're a biology school, or we're an engineering school, we're a computer science school. And I've just finished with Wendy Fishman a mammoth study of higher education in America. I think the narrowing will destroy higher education in any liberal arts sense. And so I'm a strong believer to nudge individuals towards synthesizing. And if nudges aren't nudging you, nudge yourself.
That's also a good line. I'll remember that one. So we have another question, and I told you I would try to limit the number of questions about this, but I'm gonna let one in.
And I bet I can guess what it's about.
Your theory of multiple intelligences was revolutionary and has had a lasting impact far beyond the field of intelligence. Would you be able to share more about how you came up with this immensely original idea and why it came to resonate so well with so many?
Okay, I'll be very succinct. In A Synthesizing Mind, I talk exactly about the synthesizing I did which involved a whole research team looking at a whole range of fields, ranging from anthropology to genetics to clinical psychology. And then I engaged in a 2 or 3 year synthesizing effort. And what was unusual about the book is I'd written other books before or since, but this is a book that actually changed the conversation. Even people who hate the theory can no longer pretend that when somebody say emotional intelligence or musical intelligence, that you're just speaking nonsense. So, I think that was the achievement of the book. I've used the same methods for others, not for other things I've written, not with the same success, but almost everything I've done since has been either an atonement for it or has built on it. So my whole interest on ethics and morality, which is what dominated my last 25 years, has been, I don't care what intelligences you have, I care how you use them. Do you use them benignly or do you use them malevolently? We could talk endlessly about Donald Trump's intelligence, and he's got some, but I'm interested in how he uses it, how Barack Obama uses his intelligence. I say both Nelson Mandela and Slobodan Milosevic had tremendous interpersonal intelligence. Mandela used it to bring South Africans together. Milosevic used it for ethnic cleansing. So that's 90 seconds on MI.
Wow, that's a lot. Two very different examples there. So one last question before we get off, and this one's a bit of a long one. How is the synthesizing mind affected by the enormous change we have had over the past 2 decades in access to different types of information through means and
different kinds of information?
Technology. So like throughout the past 2 decades, I was going to say maybe even more, technology has been developing rapidly, and it's completely changed the way we learn and interact and read. So is the synthesizing mind of today different from the synthesizing mind from 50 years ago? If so, how?
Okay, that's a big
question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the brain changes very slowly. That is, it changes over hundreds and thousands of years. So our brain is no different than it was even human brain 500 years ago. And people like Aristotle, Kant, Newton were tremendous synthesizers. And Darwin is to me my hero because I understand his work better than I understand Einstein's work. So the capacity to synthesize has always been there, and there have always been great synthesizers. Some people say Leonardo was the last total synthesizer. But the question I thought that was being asked, which I can say a little bit more about, is synthesizing now is easier and it's harder. It's easier because we have so much kind of information of all sorts available. There's nothing that anybody gets interested in that you can't find out about. But a lot of stuff that's up there is no good. And when we had people who were gatekeepers, they didn't always do the right thing. But when Walter Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow were giving the news 50 or 70 years ago, they did a lot of disciplining of themselves. And when Edward R. Murrow said, "We got to get rid of Senator McCarthy," or when Walter Cronkite said, "The Vietnam War is not winnable," there was a kind of a common understanding. And now you have to do the kind of stuff I do, just read very widely, talk to lots of different people, and force yourself to look at sites that you'd rather hold your nose in, because otherwise you're not getting the whole picture of how people think. And the book I mentioned, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, I could rewrite the book today. I don't think I will ever rewrite the book, but a lot of what I write about on what we call the goodproject.org is further thinking about those topics. So it's a great question, and one that I hope other people will pitch in on, not just by looking at what I've written, but looking at some of the websites. There's a Multiple Intelligences website, a Howard Gardner website, and a Good Project website. And there are a lot of my colleagues write about these kinds of things.
Great, that's interesting. Well, we'll all have to look there, but we also have a couple other websites for everyone to take a look at, including the MIT Press website, mitpress.mit.edu, where you can actually find this book, A Synthesizing Mind. It is out, so you will not have to wait many days for it to arrive at your house if you order it. And we also have some resources for alternative ways to find the book. And then we also have a link in the chat that points to all of our MIT Press Live events and videos.
Well, thanks, Hannah. And
All right, thank you.
Your colleagues, including Heather, for arranging this. And if people have questions, you can write to me and I try to answer them if I can.
Okay, where would they write to you?
I mean, I'm all too findable, but if you write Howard_Gardner@harvard.edu, it will definitely get to me. And I do take correspondence seriously.
Okay, good. I'm sure they'll all be glad to hear that. Well, thank you so much for your time, Howard.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Bye.